This isn't a story about a dog. It's a story about what happens when love chooses to wait, about how healing begins not with rescue, but with presence. It's about a woman who stopped believing in miracles and became one, a boy who had no words left, but found them in a dog's breath against his palm, and a creature who was forgotten by the world until someone remembered how to sit still and simply not walk away. Are you ready to believe again? Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, nestled deep in the snow-covered woods of Vermont, winter clung to everything like a second skin. Snow draped the rooftops' branches, hung heavy with ice, and the roads whispered beneath the wheels of every car. It was the kind of town where time moved slower in January, where breath turned to mist, and boots left crisp prints behind. That morning, the air was sharp and glassy. Frost bloomed on every window pane, and the sky was a pale, wintry blue, untouched by sunlight. Grace Whitmore, 42, parked her aging Subaru in front of Snowfall Haven Animal Rescue, its sign half buried under a recent snowdrift. She stepped out and adjusted the soft gray scarf around her neck. Grace was tall and lean, her movements always quiet, deliberate, like someone who'd learned to leave room for silence. Her honey-brown hair was pulled into a low, sensible bun, and her green eyes held the weariness of someone who'd lived too much in too little time. Grace had once been warm, openly, so smiling at neighbors laughing at sidewalk chalk art, but that was before the accident. Her husband, Thomas, a paramedic, had died in a highway pileup during a blizzard 2 winters ago. Since then, she'd withdrawn into herself like a door left ajar, slowly swinging closed. She had moved to Willow Creek 6 months ago, seeking stillness and something she couldn't name. Today, she had come to Snowfall Haven simply to donate a box of old blankets and unopened dog food, a gesture, not a mission. Inside, the shelter was dimly lit and carried the scent of bleach and pine. The front room was manned by Sarah Kemp, a stout woman in her 50s with curly silver blonde hair tied back, and a navy cardigan that bore a few stray dog hairs. Sarah was a volunteer coordinator, kind but firm, the kind of person who could calm a barking kennel with just her voice. She greeted Grace with a grateful smile and invited her to leave the box near the donation shelf. As Grace turned to go, she heard the low murmur of voices from the hallway behind the counter. Something in her made her pause. "Room 9's still not responding," a man's voice said. "She didn't even eat last night." Grace didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her curiosity stirred. Sarah noticed her lingering. "If you're not in a rush," she said gently, "there's someone I'd like you to meet. No obligation, just maybe she needs eyes that don't expect anything." Intrigued and unsure why, Grace followed Sarah down the main corridor lined with kennels. The air was filled with anxious barks, scratching paws, and the occasional low whine. Each kennel housed a hopeful pair of eyes except one. At the very end of the hallway, past a stack of folded towels and an unplugged heat lamp, was a small isolation enclosure. It was quieter here, too quiet. In the farthest corner of the enclosure, half hidden in shadow, was a golden retriever. Maple. She was smaller than most of her breed, her fur, once golden, now dulled and patchy. She curled in on herself like a question mark nose to tail, ribs faintly visible beneath her coat ears, plastered flat against her skull. Her body quivered with every sound, every motion nearby. Her eyes didn't hold anger or aggression. They held something worse, absolute fear, deep and old like a forgotten well. "She's about 9, Sarah said softly. "Came in from a busted breeder operation outside Montpelier. Never let out of her crate. Never touched except to be used." Grace knelt slowly and peered through the wire gate. "What's her name?" We're calling her Maple. She didn't have one when she came in." Grace swallowed. Maple didn't look at her. She didn't move. She only trembled. She doesn't eat when anyone's near, won't make eye contact, won't even bark. Sarah sighed. "We're not sure if she ever will." Grace didn't respond. Her eyes stayed on Maple, her breath catching slightly when the dog flinched at a sound from a distant kennel barely audible, yet it shook Maple to her core. Minutes passed. Grace remained crouched there, unmoving. A thought stirred in her, something instinctive and unformed like the faint memory of reaching for a hand in the dark. She had come here for something small, a donation, a simple kindness, and now found herself unable to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow," Grace said quietly. Sarah blinked, surprised. "Just to sit." She didn't explain further. She didn't have to. Across the street, through the window of a house with chipped blue shutters, Beau, a boy of about 10, watched through a pane, fogged with his breath. He had pale hair, always a little messy, and wore oversized flannel shirts that hung like curtains on his frame. Beau hadn't spoken in public for nearly 2 years, not since his parents' divorce, and the day his mother left for California with someone who wasn't his father. He had seen many people come and go from Snowfall Haven, but he had never seen one just sit and stay, just to look at a dog that didn't even move. He didn't know the woman's name, but he pressed his small hand against the glass, watching her stillness. Something about it made him feel less alone. The snow didn't let up. In Willow Creek, winter wasn't something that passed through, it settled in. By the time Grace returned to Snowfall Haven the next morning, the icy wind had sculpted sharp edges into the world. The sky was a soft bruised gray, and frost clung to the chain-link fence that bordered the rescue center like lichen on stone. Grace pulled her coat tighter and walked across the lot carrying with her a foldable camping chair, a thermos of tea, and an old hardcover copy of Wuthering Heights. Sarah greeted her with a knowing nod from behind the counter. "Room 9, she asked without needing confirmation. Grace simply smiled and made her way down the hallway past the chorus of barking and tails thumping against metal. The dogs had begun to recognize her scent, her rhythm, but at the end of the corridor silence still waited. Maple hadn't moved much. Her body was still curled tightly, but her eyes, once glassy with dread, now flicked briefly in Grace's direction before darting away again. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was recognition. Grace set up the chair, slowly placing it about 5 feet from Maple's kennel. She sat without a word, opened her book, and began to read, not aloud, not yet. Her presence was the message. By the 3rd day, the routine had settled like snow. Grace would arrive at 8:00 a.m. sharp, always with her chair, always with her book, always in silence. On the 2nd day, she began placing a small piece of cooked chicken cut from the sandwich she packed for lunch, about 2 feet from the gate, never any closer. She didn't watch Maple directly when she did it, and she never lingered afterward. It was an offering, not a bribe. Maple hadn't approached it the first 2 days, but on the 3rd day something changed. Her ears, usually folded flat to her skull, were not so tight anymore. They still hung low wary, but now they twitched when Grace turned a page or shifted slightly in her seat. Maple didn't flinch. Instead, she looked. It was brief, just a glance, but to Grace it felt like sunlight through frost. In those quiet hours, the shelter bustled around her. Volunteers came and went, some nodding in curiosity, others avoiding the corner where silence still reigned. Among them was Mason, a lanky college student in his early 20s who volunteered 3 mornings a week while studying veterinary science online. Mason had a shock of sandy hair and an easy grin that belied a certain guardedness in his eyes. He carried a clipboard wherever he went, and often knelt by kennels to whisper calm words to the more anxious animals. He paused the first time he saw Grace. "You're the one they call the dog whisperer already," he joked, offering a crooked smile. Grace chuckled lightly, her voice the sound of creaking winter branches. Not whispering, just waiting. Mason nodded, visibly impressed. "Takes more patience than I've got," he said before moving on. Grace noticed the way he gently slid treats under the kennel doors without making sudden moves. She wondered what had taught him that kind of softness at such a young age. Outside the shelter across the street in the blue-shuttered house, Beau watched. Every day. From his window he tracked Grace's arrival and departure, the way she walked with purpose, but not urgency, how she always left the shelter a little slower than she entered it. He watched her body language shift from rigid on the first day to something softer, more settled as the days went by. Beau had not spoken in class for over a year. He communicated through nods, shrugs, and in rare cases with drawings. He loved to draw. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he began drawing Maple. He drew her curled in the corner. He drew her under snowfall, her body barely visible in charcoal shadows. He drew the woman too tall, quiet, always reading or just sitting. His drawings were not exact replicas, but emotional impressions, lines that captured mood more than detail. On the third day, he placed one of them, Maple, alone in her corner, but with the woman nearby, softly drawn in graphite on the front porch of Grace's rented cottage 3 doors down. He folded the paper in half and left it without knocking. Grace found the drawing that evening tucked into the edge of her doormat, no signature, no note. The lines were tentative, like someone afraid of being seen, but there was care in every curve of Maple's trembling frame. Grace stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in her gloved hand. She didn't know who had left it, but it felt like an echo of her own quiet hope. The next morning, Maple met her eyes, for a full second, then 2. Grace didn't move. She didn't smile or speak. She only blinked slowly as dogs do when trying to reassure each other. Maple did not flinch. The cold in Willow Creek had shifted. It wasn't warmer snow, still clung to rooftops, and icicles lined the eaves like silent wind chimes, but something in the air felt less heavy, as if winter was starting to loosen its grip. On this particular afternoon, the light came soft and slanted through the rescue center's windows, coloring the walls in gold and gray, as if the day itself was holding its breath. Grace arrived as always, chair in hand, book unopened pocket, warm with the scent of roasted chicken. Her steps were slower now, not out of hesitation but reverence. For the last 4 days she had become a fixture in the quiet hallway of Snowfall Haven, predictable and unthreatening, a piece of furniture with a heartbeat. Today, something felt different. Maple was not curled into the wall when Grace rounded the corner. The dog had moved slightly forward in her kennel, her body still low to the ground, but her gaze was steady, direct. Her fur, though still patchy in places, had begun to lose its dullness. The tremble that once racked her frame had settled into the gentler rhythm of a creature aware of her surroundings, no longer paralyzed by them. Grace didn't speak. She folded into her chair with familiar ease and reached slowly into her coat. The small piece of chicken sat warm in her hand, its scent rising gently in the air between them. For the first time, she did not place it on the ground. She held it there, her palm open and steady, resting it lightly against the gate. Maple didn't move at first. Her breath came fast, shallow. Her eyes flitted to the left, then back to Grace's hand. Seconds passed, then a full minute. Grace didn't blink, and then Maple moved. It was barely a shuffle at first. A paw forward, hesitant, then another. Her nose twitched rapidly, ears low but alert. Her body was still angled for retreat, but she didn't stop. Slowly, shakily, Maple inched toward the gate. Her eyes flicked up just once, meeting Grace's gaze before snapping away. She stepped close enough that her nose hovered just above Grace's hand. She paused there, breathing in the scent of food and of something more. Grace's hand stayed still, fingers open, palm flat. Then Maple took the food. She didn't bolt. She didn't retreat to her corner. She stayed there chewing carefully, still watching Grace out of the corner of one eye. And Grace, who had spent months keeping herself from crying, from breaking, let the tears fall silently. She didn't sob, she didn't tremble. She just wept the way snow melts under the sun, softly without sound. That night, after she returned home and set her chair by the radiator to dry, Grace found another drawing on her porch. This one was different. It showed Maple recognizably, Maple down to the uneven patches of fur resting her head gently on a woman's hand. The woman's features were only sketched, but Grace recognized the posture, the open palm. She stared at it for a long time. That hadn't happened, not yet, but somehow it felt less like a fantasy and more like a prophecy. The next morning, Grace arrived earlier than usual. The shelter was still unlocking its doors, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh snow and coffee from a thermos someone had left near reception. Inside the hallway, she noticed something, a small crumpled piece of paper caught between the edge of Maple's kennel and the wall. It was another drawing. Unfinished this time, just the outline of Maple's face and a half-drawn sun. "Someone's been watching you," she whispered to Maple, not expecting a reaction. But behind her, a faint shuffle echoed from the window beside the hallway. Grace turned. There, just beyond the frosted pane, was a face, young, pale, startled. Beau. He stood in a thick blue hoodie, too big for him, a sketchbook clutched tightly in his arms. For a moment he froze, unsure whether to run or vanish behind the curtains. Grace didn't raise her voice or step outside. She simply turned her head, met his eyes, and offered the softest smile. Then she said, "Thank you for the drawing yesterday." Beau's expression didn't change. He didn't smile or nod, but he didn't disappear either. He stood there for a second longer, then ducked behind the window again. Inside the kennel, Maple shifted. Her ears twitched. Her tail gave the tiniest movement a sway, uncertain but deliberate. Grace reached down her hand, open again. Maple hesitated for less than a heartbeat this time. She stepped forward and pressed her head softly against Grace's palm. Winter in Willow Creek was unpredictable, like a heartbeat skipping a beat before pounding again. That morning the sky was unusually clear, the snow on the ground glittering like crushed glass under a pale sun. Grace stood in the back lot of Snowfall Haven, watching Maple take cautious steps through the thin layer of snow. It was Maple's first time outside the kennel. Her fur had begun to fill out golden strands, smoothing the patchy hollows once left by fear and neglect. She walked with hesitation, but her paws no longer trembled with every step. Maple sniffed the air and kept close to Grace's side, occasionally glancing up as if to ask, "Is this still safe?" Grace had prepared for this moment with care. Sarah had secured the fence around the outer lot, and Mason, always attentive, stood watch from the porch mug of coffee in hand. "Forecast says we might get flurries," he had said earlier, his sandy hair, wind-blown nose pink from the cold. But no big storms. Grace had smiled. "In Willow Creek, I'll believe the forecast when I see it." An hour passed, and for a while, everything held a peaceful stillness. Maple sniffed patches of snow, took slow laps around the perimeter, and even paused to watch a sparrow land on the fence post. Grace never rushed her. She simply walked nearby, quiet and reassuring, letting Maple lead. What none of them noticed was the clouds gathering over the distant ridgeline. The storm rolled in fast. It began with a sharp gust that stole Grace's breath and whipped her scarf sideways. The air turned metallic and dense. Then came the snow, dry biting flakes, driven sideways by a sudden wall of wind. Mason dropped his coffee. "Grace," he shouted, pointing to the trees behind the lot. "That's not Flurry's." Maple froze, ears shooting up. Then a sound cracked the sky, a low, rolling thunder, deep and unfamiliar. That's when she bolted. She shot across the yard and into the sparse tree line, head low tail, tucked eyes wide with primal panic. Maple Grace screamed, running after her boots sinking into the quickly thickening snow. The cold hit hard as she entered the woods. Branches shook, snow fell in heavy clumps, and the storm turned brutal in minutes. Grace's lungs burned. She called Maple's name again and again, voice hoarse from the cold air. "Maple, Maple, come back." Visibility dropped to feet. Her boots slipped on frozen patches under the trees. Her coat, soaked through, clung to her like a second skin of ice. Still, she didn't stop. She stumbled forward at heart pounding in her ears, louder than the wind. She had never been afraid of snowstorms until now. Then she saw a flash of gold through the white. But it wasn't Maple. It was the pale light of Beau's coat. Beau stood frozen in place just beyond the last tree, half buried in drifting snow. His soaked arms wrapped tightly around a thick plaid blanket, Grace's blanket, the one she always carried in her car. His lips were slightly blue, and his eyes were wide, staring not at the storm, but at something behind her. Grace turned. Maple was there. The dog had returned not to Grace's call, but to the sight of the small boy in the storm alone, and silent, wrapped in the scent of the only woman she had begun to trust. Without hesitation, Maple moved toward Beau. Her body no longer shrunk from sound or motion. She stepped between him and the wind, pressing her body against his knees, tail curved protectively. Then, for the first time since she'd been rescued, Maple lifted her head and let out a single sharp bark. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Grace stumbled forward, eyes stinging from wind and tears. She wrapped the blanket around Beau and held him tightly, her hands trembling. Maple remained close, head low, breathing heavy but steady. Together, they moved back toward the shelter, Grace, half carrying Beau Maple never more than an arm's length away. Mason met them at the gate, his face pale with panic. He helped bring them inside, where Sarah had already lit the space heater and spread towels on the floor. They dried Beau first. His mother, Lee, arrived minutes later, late 30s, tall with tired eyes and a gentle voice. She was the kind of woman who dressed in quiet earth tones and always looked like she had one hand full of laundry and the other holding someone's hurt. She wrapped Beau in her arms and whispered his name over and over, her voice shaking more than his small frame. Grace sat nearby, with Maple curled at her feet. The dog hadn't moved since they came inside, but her eyes never left Beau. Later that night, long after the storm passed and the world turned still again, Lee tucked Beau into bed. She sat on the edge of his mattress, brushing back his damp hair when he reached for her wrist. His voice, barely a whisper, cracked the quiet. "I think I can talk to Grace." It was the first sentence he had spoken in nearly 18 months. The thaw came slowly to Willow Creek. Winter did not leave with a grand gesture, but with quiet apologies, snow shrinking into puddles, icicles falling like broken glass from roof edges, and sunlight returning in golden slants through leafless trees. On a breezy afternoon in early March, the town finally exhaled. It was spring, not in full bloom yet, but in promise. Grace Whitmore opened the back door of her cottage, letting the breeze sweep through the kitchen. The faint scent of thawed earth mixed with lemon tea on the stovetop. In the living room, a dog bed lay in the warmest patch of sunlight, though it was rarely used. Maple, now sleek with a full coat of glistening gold fur, preferred the rug by Grace's armchair, or more often the side of her bed. It had been 3 weeks since Maple came home. Sarah, at Snowfall Haven, had walked Grace through the paperwork with tears pricking behind her glasses. "She chose you," Sarah had said, voice warm and worn like her favorite cardigan. and I've never seen her choose anyone before." Maple adjusted quickly to her new world. At night, she slept with her head resting lightly on the floor beside Grace's bed. During the day, she followed her through every room, never clingy, just quietly nearby, as if to remind herself this wasn't temporary. Grace learned to move slowly to announce her presence when entering a room, to never close a door without saying Maple's name. But more often than not, it was Maple who initiated closeness. Her tail wagged when Grace hummed, her eyes softened when the kettle whistled. She still flinched at loud noises, but she no longer ran. And at night, she dreamed gently, no longer thrashing in her sleep. That afternoon, as sunlight pooled across the hardwood floor, Beau appeared at the back gate. He was wearing his usual oversized hoodie, now a shade too short in the sleeves. His blonde hair stuck out at angles from under a baseball cap, and his sneakers bore the first stains of Mudspring's true signature. Grace waved him in. "She's on the rug," she said softly. Beau didn't speak, not at first. He stepped quietly into the room, eyes immediately finding Maple, who lifted her head and blinked at him, then wagged her tail once slowly. He knelt beside her. Maple shifted, then gently rested her chin across his legs, as if she'd been waiting for him all morning. Grace returned to her armchair, a book resting lightly in her lap. She didn't turn a page. She watched instead. Beau traced his fingers along Maple's ears, his hand trembling just slightly. Then, after a full minute of silence, he looked up. "Do you think," he began, his voice rough from disuse but clear, "do you think Maple could teach me how not to be scared anymore?" Grace didn't answer right away. Her heart swelled with something too big to name. She leaned forward, met his gaze with the gentleness of someone who understood what fear could do to a soul. "I think," she said, "she already is." Later that evening, after Beau had gone home, and the sky turned the color of dusky lavender, Grace sat at her kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp casting soft shadows on the wall. Maple lay curled beneath her feet. On the table was her old laptop, the cursor blinking against a blank document. Grace stared at it for a long time before typing the title, "Brighter Than Silence." She wrote the story not as a therapist or a rescuer, but as a witness. She told of a dog who had forgotten touch could be soft, and a boy who had forgotten words could be safe. Of how silence wasn't always emptiness. Sometimes it was the space where trust was born. It took her 3 days to finish it. When she sent the article to the Willow Creek Lantern, the small town's local newsletter, she didn't expect much. A polite reply, maybe. But within a week, letters began arriving, emails and handwritten notes, some tear-stained, others scrawled in blocky handwriting. A retired teacher wrote, "I adopted a cat from the shelter after reading your story. I didn't think I had room in my life for anyone again. I was wrong." A high school girl wrote, "My brother doesn't talk. I showed him your article. He hugged me." There were dozens more. Grace printed every one and kept them in a folder on the bookshelf beside her armchair. She didn't reread them often, but she liked knowing they were there. Proof that silence, when honored, could speak louder than anything. On the first warm Sunday of spring, the back door stood open. The breeze brought in the scent of blooming crocus and distant rain. Grace sat in her armchair, book open but forgotten. Maple lay with her head resting across Beau's lap as the boy leaned against the couch, a sketch pad in one hand, the other tangled in Maple's fur. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. And through the window, sunlight spilled across the wooden floor like a quiet benediction, like the beginning of something new. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not sudden or loud. They arrive quietly through patience, through love, through the decision to stay when others walk away. Maple was a broken soul forgotten by the world. Beau was a boy silenced by fear. But through Grace, whose name fittingly means the unearned kindness of God, they both found healing. This story reminds us that God often works through the gentle, the unnoticed, the ones who simply refuse to give up. He places the right hearts in the right places at the right time. Not every rescue comes with flashing lights. Some come with a soft hand, a warm blanket, and a heart willing to wait. In our daily lives, we pass by silent cries for help all the time. A neighbor struggling with loneliness, a child hiding behind silence, an animal too afraid to hope. But what if we stopped? What if we sat down like Grace did and waited long enough for someone to feel safe again? If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes in second chances. Comment your thoughts below, and if you believe that even the most broken can be healed through love and faith, write Amen in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and may God bless each of you for your compassion.